North Korea remains defiant in its development of nuclear weapons and strategic missiles, even as the U.S. cracks down on similar weapons ambitions by Iran. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, April 16th. Here in Seoul, I'm Min Sun-hee. While the world's attention is currently centered on the conflict in the Middle East, North Korea has been persistently pushing ahead with its weapons ambitions. For more on this reality, I have Celio Fioretti with French daily Le Croix here in the studio. Celio, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
I also have Professor Hannah Kim at Sogang University joining our talk virtually. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
We shall start here in the studio. Celia, let's begin with news about North Korea's latest missile tests, this time from a warship, I believe, and the significance of these latest shows of strength, Celio.
Yeah, it's quite a significant development. What North Korea has done here is a test fire, a combination of cruise missile and anti-ship missile directly from a newly built naval destroyer under the supervision of Kim Jong-un. According to state media, the warship called Cheon launched two so-called strategic missile, which is important terminology because the North Korean regime usually uses this word strategic for systems that could launch a nuclear warhead, for example. And these missile reportedly flew for over 2 hours before hitting their target. Now, beyond just the technical performance of it, the significance here is really strategic, I would say. First, this suggests that North Korea is shifting its strategy toward more of a sea-based strike capability. That's a major step because it has a more it makes it more difficult for any other nation to preempt, to have a preemptive strike on their missile if they are not launched from a base that we already know on the ground. The boat can be anywhere on the sea, so that makes it more difficult for other nations. Secondly, it looks like a final validation phase before the ship is fully deployed at sea and it's in marine. So the South Korean officials are interpreting this system as a final check of the destroyer's capabilities before integrating the Navy. More broadly, it fits into, I would say, a bigger phase that we see now in North Korean army is really developing, modernizing its army, especially the naval capabilities. Well, North Korea still is lagging far behind other powers in the region, Japan or South Korea, but still they're trying to improve, and Russia's help might boost and make it faster, this development. So it's not yet a game changer, but it's very worrying to see, and we'll see how South Korea can also adapt itself with this new menace now.
Right. In the meantime, Professor Kim, I wonder, what do you believe is prompting this latest displays of defiance by North Korea?
Now, so I don't think North Korea's recent missile launches are necessarily random or impulsive outbursts in any way. That they do reflect a deliberate and patterned strategy that is driven by a mix of security concerns as well as strategic signaling and regime-level incentives. Now, first, we have to keep in mind that Pyongyang views the joint U.S.-South Korea military exercises and extended deterrence commitments as direct threats to its regime survival. So from its perspective, these exercises simulate invasion scenarios and reinforce a hostile environment. And so in response, missile launches are used to reinforce deterrence and signal resolve. So in that sense, it will respond to what it perceives as hostile pressure. But also, these tests are part of a systematic military modernization effort, which I think was mentioned earlier as well. So each launch helps improve missile accuracy, survivability, and operational readiness. But also, one thing I also wanted to mention is that there is a clear element of strategic timing and opportunism. So North Korea often escalates its activities when the international community is very preoccupied with some other crises, right? And so right now, with global attention focused on conflicts like those in the Middle East, North Korea is effectively reminding the international community that it remains relevant and it's still an unresolved issue, security issue that cannot be ignored. So in that sense, it's trying to remind the international world that I'm still here, right? And in addition, there's also the domestic side because demonstrations of military capability play a key role in reinforcing regime legitimacy and projecting strength to international audiences as well as internal audiences. And this helps justify the continued prioritization of defense spending despite economic difficulties domestically. So, in short, there are many different reasons for North Korea's actions. It's not just reactive, but it's also deliberate. And it's a multi layered strategy that aims at deterrence, leverage, and regime stability.
Right. Celio, a U.S. think tank believes North Korea may have completed building a uranium enrichment facility at its Yongbyon nuclear complex. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular finding?
Yes, this is a very important development, qualified as a very concerning by the International Atomic Energy Agency chief, Rafael Grossi, yesterday in Seoul. And it comes from a satellite analysis also by the Beyond Parallel project, which is linked to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. What we're seeing is that North Korea appears to have externally at least, completed a new building that could be an enrichment facility, uranium enrichment facility at the Yongbyon nuclear complex. And how we know it would be used that way is that it looks very similar to another one that they already built and used in Kangsan in a different complex. And this assessment aligned with earlier warning by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has already flagged the building, the power and all the facilities around, and also they monitored the activities of the nuclear reactor there, and they saw an increase in high intensity activity there. So why does this matter? And because enriched uranium is used as the primary ingredient, we'd say, to make a nuclear weapon. And there's already it's already known that North Korea has around a couple dozen. That's what the Rafael Grossi, the chief of the International Atomic Energy Agency, said. A couple dozen of nuclear warhead. Also, the Ministry of Unification said earlier this year that North Korea already has extracted 100 kilogram of plutonium over the last 30 years, and only 16 kilo last year. So that could also produce more than 20 supplementary warheads, nuclear warheads. So it's very worrying, and we see really an increase in the desire for North Korea to really improve and extend its nuclear arsenal. I guess what we see in the world right now is that North Korea really see the nuclear arsenal as the life insurance of the regime. The only way now to protect itself from any possible military operation orchestrated probably by Trump, as we saw with Iran, with Venezuela, other like-minded countries with North Korea, they've been attacked by the US. So North Korea really is doubling down on the nuclear arsenal to protect itself and deter the US to intervene.
Right. Professor Kim, Celio just mentioned Tehran. I wonder, do you suppose the Trump administration is fiercely cracking down on Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, given North Korea's ability to have advanced its nuclear weapons program over the years? And if that is the case, do you suppose that this reality proves dialogue alone may not be the solution to denuclearization, if you will?
So I think in order to kind of answer that, we have to think a little bit more about North Korea as a case. And I think President Trump may view the North Korean case as a missed opportunity, because back in the 1990s, when Pyongyang announced its intention to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT for short, tensions escalated to the point where the United States seriously considered military options, including limited strikes on nuclear facilities. But ultimately, Washington chose diplomacy, which then led to the 1994 Agreed Framework, which then temporarily froze parts of North Korea's nuclear program. So Trump may believe that in hindsight, that decision delayed rather than prevented North Korea's nuclearization, which then allowed North Korea to steadily advance its nuclear program and make it a far more dangerous and much harder situation to deal with today. So, from that perspective, he may be inclined to think that early, decisive actions are sometimes necessary to prevent a problem from becoming irreversible. But the irony here is quite striking because, if anything, current pressures on countries like Iran may actually reinforce the opposite lessons from Pyongyang. So rather than seeing coercion as a reason to reconsider its nuclear program, North Korea is likely interpreting these developments as proof that only nuclear weapons can guarantee regime survival. So rather than weakening North Korea's resolve, the situation could be deepening its commitment to its nuclear arsenal, making denuclearization even more difficult over time, which could also be something that we see as a self-reinforcing cycle. So the more the US emphasizes these coercive tools, the more dynamic, the more North Korea clings to this kind of deterrent. And we can see this in other places as well.
Right, then as perhaps proof of what Professor Kim has just said, Celio, a recent report by Daily NK says that North Korea has ordered its diplomats to push for nuclear arms control talks instead of denuclearization talks with regard to its nuclear arsenal. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, this report from Daily NK shows what could be a shift in North Korea diplomatic doctrine. According to the report, Pyongyang issued a directive in late March instructing both its foreign affairs and military official to abandon denuclearization as a negotiating framework altogether. Instead, diplomats are not being asked to push for arms control talks with the United States. Though there's no the regime hasn't officialized this in any document yet, so there's no proof of that really being changing. But it would be plausible and very understandable from North Korea, since the Hanoi meeting, this policy has become kind of de facto policy of the North Korean regime. The reasoning behind this is explicit. The regime now see its nuclear arsenal as irreversible and non-negotiable. And the position was formalized already in 2022 in the national law, and even more recently, the Congress also repeated that policy stance. Really now it's becoming the foundation of the state's survival. And what does that mean in practice is that, well, for North Korea now, the option to the way of arms control is the only way possible for the regime. And rather than negotiating away its arsenal, as it could be happening, as we said just before, now it's seeking recognition as a nuclear state, a nuclear power in the region, and doesn't want to give away its arsenal, rather maybe exchange for lesser sanctions, less important section, for maybe a freeze on the nuclear arsenal, or at least reducing its scope. This is much closer to what we saw during the Cold War between the USSR and the US, for example. But what we see also, on the other hand, is that if North Korea is willing to talk maybe about arms control, historically, the US has always opposed this strategy with North Korea, and we don't necessarily see it changing for now. Trump did admit a little bit that North Korea is a nuclear state, but the official position of Washington and Seoul is still to go for a fully complete denuclearization of the peninsula. So now I would say it's in the hands of the US now to decide what will be the way. Is it pertinent right now to pursue a full, complete denuclearization, or should we talk about arms control or not?
Right, and in the meantime then, Professor Kim, speaking purely as a scholar with politics all aside, what would be a feasible approach to North Korea's nuclear weapons program? Should we continue to demand denuclearization, or should we consider nuclear arms control?
I think it's getting harder to put politics aside as a scholar at times, but in my personal opinion, I don't see denuclearization and arms control as mutually exclusive goals. Denuclearization should remain the long-term goal, but in the short term, a more feasible and pragmatic approach is to reopen dialogue and pursue arms control as an interim step in order to get to the long-term goal. And in fact, this kind of sequencing has precedent, and we are already seeing a similar dynamic in the case of Iran, where negotiations have repeatedly stalled when the United States insisted on complete nuclear disarmament upfront. while Iran resisted such maximalist demands. And so progress became possible only when the objective shifted to a more gradual, step by step approach, one that was focused on first limiting and managing nuclear activities rather than eliminating them outright. And so scholars have also emphasized that narrowing objectives and pursuing incremental agreements was key to breaking diplomatic deadlock, right? If we can't ask them to do 10, we have to start with step one. And North Korea, in this sense, is even more challenging case because unlike Iran, it already has developed and operationalized nuclear weapons. And this has fundamentally altered the negotiating landscape. And this makes it achieving complete denuclearization in a single step, in particular, far more difficult, if not unrealistic, in the near term. And historical experiences have also reinforced this point because, despite decades of negotiations, agreements, and pressure, diplomatic efforts have failed to halt a lot of the nuclear advancement that we have seen. And so, for that reason, insisting on immediate full denuclearization really risks diplomatic deadlock, and a phased approach, one that begins with arms control measures to cap, freeze, and stabilize the program, may be the only practical way forward. And this type of approach doesn't really require abandoning denuclearization as a principle, but it reframes it as a long-term process rather than an immediate precondition.
Right, indeed. Celia, beyond its nuclear weapons ambitions, North Korea has also been actively engaged in diplomacy. I mean, North Korea's Kim Jong-un, he recently met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Pyongyang. What has been disclosed about their discussions?
What we know between this meeting between Kim Jong-un and Wang Yi is that it signals a deepening strategic alignment between Pyongyang and Beijing, even if concrete policy outcomes still remain quite limited. First, on substance, Kim explicitly voiced support for China's vision of a multipolar world, which is a global order less influenced by the United States and the West overall. He also reaffirmed backing for the One China policy, which is Beijing stands that Taiwan is part of its territory. And that's a strong political signal of alignment on the core sovereignty issue for China. Second, both sides also emphasized that they need to strengthen their bilateral ties. Kim Jong-un stressed that the cooperation has become more important given the current geopolitical situation, while Wang Yi, is Chinese the foreign minister, said relations are entering a new phase and after recent high-level exchange between two countries, including a summit with Xi Jinping last year. Now, interestingly, the readout is quite vague, I would say, on specific matters. State media mentioned discussion on regional and international issues of mutual concern, but we don't really know what it means. But there's no explicit reference also to the United States or to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East also, for example. So that suggests there's still some kind of ambiguity between the two countries. They don't really know what to show on the public narrative and what's the official position to the outside world. Finally, in terms of broader significance, this meeting fits into Kim Jong-un's strategy of breaking out of isolation. He has done it with Russia, trying to build a new relationship, also with Belarus more recently. So he's trying to open new channels of discussion outside of just the US and to also bring more benefit for the country with still the economy lagging far behind any other countries in the world. He's trying to get new opportunities to fund its arsenal, to maybe fund its economy also.
You're right, indeed. So that would be the strategy of North Korea's Kim Jong-un. In the meantime, Professor Kim, there is quite a bit of speculation about the purpose of Wang Yi's latest visit to North Korea. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Wang Yi's visit should be understood as a part of a broader strategic recalibration by China. At the most basic level, it was aimed at restoring and strengthening China-North Korea relations, which had somewhat loosened during the pandemic, and it had also loosened as Pyongyang moved closer to Russia. We always have to keep in mind that the relationship between China and North Korea was one that, was often described like lips and teeth. And now we are no longer seeing that kind of relationship. And so Beijing likely wants to reassert its influence and ensure that North Korea does not drift too far away from its traditional partner. And as Celio mentioned earlier, this could also be helping in terms of feeling isolated from the international realm from both China and North Korea. But at the same time, the visit reflects a need for closer strategic coordination in a shifting geopolitical environment. Like both China and North Korea are not only feeling a little bit more isolated in the current geopolitical climate, but they're also facing increasing pressure from the United States and its allies. And there is a shared interest among both in managing regional tensions and aligning positions on broader international issues. And so the timing of this is also very significant. This visit comes when there's a lot of heightened global instability, and there's a lot of potential diplomatic developments that are possibly happening that are involving the United States, as well as US-China summits and the possibility of renewed engagement with North Korea in general. So from that perspective, it is possible that both Beijing and Pyongyang are seeking to coordinate their positions in advance. But overall, I would interpret the visit as China attempting to reestablish a little bit of leverage over North Korea, as well as strengthening bilateral ties in general, and also possibly preparing for a potentially challenging diplomatic landscape on the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Also, of course, ahead of its upcoming summit with U.S. President Donald Trump in May over in Beijing. All right, Professor Kim, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you so much for having me.
Celia here in the studio. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching and see you same time tomorrow.